Hello my friends, and welcome to the channel for another Escape From Tarkov video. We live in exciting times right now, and to make a long story short, Recoil just got buffed across the board on every single weapon in Tarkov. And in this video, I just wanted to cover a few of the builds that I'm most excited to get my hands on and take out in some Tarkov raids after these big Recoil changes. Essentially, I would say that the 4 weapons I picked for this video were once upon a time the 4 horsemen of the old Tarkov recoil system. The HK416, the MPX, the M4A1, and the SA58. Now I wouldn't say that they're all back to the zero recoil meta that they once represented, but they're definitely all a lot more deadly after the recoil changes. These builds will be basically the best in slot setups for these weapons. So it might be out of reach for some people who aren't done maxing traders or doing some of these quests yet, but I wanted to show them at their full potential. I plan on covering a lot of builds in the near future after these new recoil changes, but for today, these are the builds that I have for you. So let's get right into it, starting with perhaps the most anticipated recipient of the recoil changes, the HK416. The 416 was once the dominant force in Tarkov, but for the last 18 months, it has sat collecting dust in most people's stashes, waiting patiently for its moment, waiting to return with a vengeance. After these recent recoil buffs, I can definitely say it's feeling a lot better. The initial jump is still pretty high because of the fire rate, but it corrects itself much faster, allowing you to really take advantage of the high fire rate without missing most of your mag because of the recoil. To start this build off, swap out the barrel for the 20-inch 416 barrel, which gives you a big recoil bonus and allows you to add the extended handguards for even more stats. For the suppressor, on this build, I have the Griffin Armament M4SD suppressor mounted on the G-Lock muzzle device. This setup gets you great recoil stats, and it has less of an ergonomics penalty compared to some of the other better suppressors. You can also use the Saker suppressor, the Thor suppressor, or the Thunder Beast Ultra 5 and get pretty similar stats, so if these are cheaper on the market, you're not missing too much by using them. Next up, I swap out the handguard for the Strike Industries Crux handguard, which has great recoil and ergonomics. After adding a pair of M-Lock rails, I stick on an RK1 foregrip and an X400 flashlight. If you want to really min-max the recoil, you can add the RK2 grip instead, or you can use the SE5 or the RVG for better ergonomics. All of these options are definitely viable. Next, I swap out the stock for the Magpul PRS Gen 3 stock for the maximum recoil reduction. You can also use the MOE stock and a rubber butt pad if you have those for better ergonomics. For the last major part on the build, I add the Graal S pistol grip for another big ergonomics boost. Finally, I just add a simple EOTech hollow sight and the build is pretty much done. You can also swap out the charging handle and the iron sights for more ergonomics if you feel like it. With this setup, you get 39 vertical recoil, about 35 ergonomics with a 30-round mag attached, and with the recoil buffs, you can definitely use this thing to spray 5.56 downrange with great effect. Coming up next, we have the SA58, a rifle that, like the 416, was once at the absolute peak of the meta in Tarkov, but has largely been dormant for quite a long time. The SA58 definitely still has some kick to it, especially in full auto. But after the recoil changes, it is much easier to keep track of your reticle while firing, and it returns to center much more quickly after firing short bursts. The SA58 might not be back to its former glory, but with more controllable recoil and a great flea market price because player scavs spawn with these things, I think the SA58 is now going to be quite a viable option for a full auto 308 rifle. After buying an SA58, usually on the flea market, the first thing I add is the KAC muzzle brake kit, and then the KAC PRS QDC 762 suppressor, both of which need to be unlocked by doing Mechanic's Gunsmith questline. But this combo gets you amazing recoil stats once you do unlock it. Next, I add the CASV FAL handguard, which does require special CASV rails that are only sold at Mechanic level 4 or sometimes on the flea market, but for outrageous prices. Next, I add the RK1 or the RK2 foregrip for maximum recoil control and an X400 flashlight as the tactical device. For the last main parts on the build, I swap the stock for the SA58 BRS stock and the pistol grip out for the Fab AG FAL pistol grip. Finally, I add the Extreme Duty dust cover for a sight mount, and then just a simple hollow sight, or whatever you prefer will work here. This setup comes out to around 78 vertical recoil, or a bit less if you use the RK2 foregrip. The ergonomics is pretty horrible, but this thing will work well as a close to mid-range sledgehammer of a weapon. For the third build in this video, I really want to give the MPX a bit of a highlight because I was truly amazed at how much better the recoil felt on this thing. The MPX was always one of my favorite weapons back in the old times. It wasn't super powerful, but the recoil was so low and the fire rate so high that it made up for the weakness of each individual bullet by letting you put a whole mag into the same hole. For a while now, the MPX felt kind of unusable. But after the recoil changes, it honestly feels like this thing is back to its old self, and is truly a laser beam when using a fully modded build. First, I go ahead and swap out the barrel for the longest 14-inch MPX barrel, and then I add on the Lancer OEM handguard as well for extra recoil reduction. For the muzzle device, I generally use the Osprey 9mm suppressor because it's both the best and usually one of the cheapest on the flea market, which is really convenient. After adding some M-LOK rails to the handguard, I stick on an RVG foregrip and an X400 flashlight. You could use a more recoil-focused grip, but on the MPX, I honestly don't think you need it. Next, I add the F1 skeletonized pistol grip for some extra ergonomics, and the PM ULSS stock for a cheap and easy buff to the recoil stats. Finally, you can add a sight to the top rail, and add one backup iron sight for one more ergonomics point if you feel like it. This build ends up with 26 vertical recoil, but it feels more like 2 vertical recoil. It's incredibly easy to control, and I cannot wait to stock up on AP 9mm ammo to use this thing. To close out this video, of course, I need to talk about how the M4 feels when fully modded, and the short answer is that it feels really quite nice. I think it hits a nice middle ground between the old laser beam recoil and the bouncy mess that it was up until this buff. It's not perfect, but it's definitely a lot better. And I'm kind of excited to try out a bunch of different builds with the M4 and see how they all perform. For this one though, I'll be covering the meta setup, or my version of the meta setup anyways. First up, you want to replace all the vital parts on the M4, starting with the receiver. The MUR-1S receiver is the best, technically, but it's now quest locked behind the guide. So about 10% of total Tarkov players will ever unlock this one realistically. My pick instead is the Novesk Gen 3 upper receiver, which can be bought on the flea market for an okay price most of the time, or from mechanic level 4 for about 28,000 rubles. Next, you also want to swap the buffer tube out for the SI Advanced Buffer Tube, or the RTM ATP Buffer Tube if you don't have that one unlocked from Gunsmith Part 21. You'll also need to swap the gas block out for the JP Gas System 5B if you have that unlocked, or the MK12 gas block if you don't. Finally, you can also swap out the barrel for the longer 18 or 20-inch barrels, but personally, I don't think it's necessary, and it does add a lot of cost to your build. Next, I add the Griffin Armament M4SD suppressor onto the G-LOK muzzle device. Once again though, like the HK, you can also use the Saker, the Thor, or the Thunderbeast suppressor as well. For the handguard, you can go with the MK10 handguard to save some cash, or you can rock the SAI quad rail handguard, which gets you the best overall stats, but it is a bit expensive at about 40,000 rubles. This handguard needs an M-LOK rail for a grip, and then I add the RK1 foregrip and an X400 flashlight onto the build. Next, I'll swap out the pistol grip for the Graal S, and then I add the Magpul PRS Gen 3 stock for the best recoil. Finally, you can add some MBUS iron sights for more ergonomics and replace the charging handle, but after that, the build is pretty much done. With the default 370mm barrel, this build ends up with 35 recoil, and with the buffs to how it feels to shoot this thing, it's definitely in a pretty nice spot. And I'm very excited to be rocking M4s as my main weapon again. Well, that basically covers it for these builds. I feel like I hit the most obvious choices for guns to try with the new recoil system in this one. And for my next showcase, I think I want to check out the other 5.56 rifles, mainly the AUG and the G36, and see if they're in a better spot after these big changes. What do you think? Is this big sweeping recoil change to every gun a good thing? Or do you think they should have changed guns individually? Does your favorite build feel better after the changes? Let me know what you think down in the comments. Thanks for checking out the video. I've got links to my Twitch stream and Discord server down below for anyone interested. And until next time, stay safe in Tarkov City.